Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we are going to dig into kefir feeding for pre-weaned calves and what you need to know. Welcome, Al. Great to have you back with us. And of course, we want to invite anyone who's tuning in to post any questions you might have there in your screen on the chat or in your social media feed. So, Dr. Kertz, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. It's good to be back for another month. You may recognize that there's not very often I've discussed trials with various additives. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because there's so many of those trials and the results are very mixed. And I think it's because there's so many variables involved here. For instance, how well do the calves do in that particular study at that particular time? Sometimes calves do really well and you can't figure out why, and sometimes they don't do very well and you can't figure out why. So that can be a factor, because if the calves aren't doing as well and you're trying to improve their performance, you have a bigger challenge than if they're not doing as well. So then there's the fact that there's so many different additives, there's different levels of those additives. And then, as we said, the types and levels in the milk replacer can vary. Do you only put it in the milk replacer? Do you also put it in the starter? So there's so many different variables. But I decided to do an evaluation of this particular study because it's a single calf trial and is done with a product, Kefir, which is a fermentation product. So it's not something that I know is out there commercially. And it was done to shed light on this particular additive at a New York State Research Institute. It's the Minor Institute, which has done some calf trials through the years. So it's a very reputable group. Sarah Morrison was the lead person doing this particular study. So they used calves from their own herds, their own research herd, and it was done during the winter time. So it's a cold weather trial. The calves were removed from the dam after birth, weighed, and then had a weight range. They only used calves within 70 to 119 pounds at birth. And then during the first 48 hours, they received 2 4-liter colostrum replacer feedings. And they had a greater than or equal to 25% bricks. So I'm not going to go into details about the rest of the trial because you can find that, but a few other issues are not issues but points is that they fed a 24% protein, 20% fat milk replacer, 13% solids twice a day. And then they fed a step up, step down protocol. So they began with 8 liters a day from days 3 to 14. Then they stepped that up to day 42, kept it there. And then they started a step down process, 6 liters per day. And then the 4 liters per day. And then on the last day, had been reduced to 2 liters. And the purpose of stepping down is to try to encourage calf starter intake before they're weaned. And in this case, the calf starter was a custom product, which was all pelleted. And you see the specifications were that it was supposed to be about a 22% dry matter protein. It was higher than that. And then because it was wintertime in a very cold climate, they used calf jackets up to 4 weeks of age. So a total of 81 calves were enrolled in this trial. That's 27 per treatment. And the 3 treatments were control, which consisted of 125 milliliters of unpasteurized saleable whole milk. That's like a placebo. Or the second one, 125 milliliters of a single fermentation of kefir. Or the third treatment had 125 milliliters of that plus 1% of an autolyzed yeast product. So there were those 3 different treatments. And if we look at table 1, we can see the specifications for these products. The whole milk, this is as is, so it had 4% fat, which on one hand I thought was higher, but the Holstein fat, instead of 3.5, it's running over 4% in breed due to genetic selection and I guess in feeding. And then if you look at the milk replacer, it was running a bit lower than the 24% protein and a bit higher than the 20% fat. The calf starter was a 23 protein, and that's a bit lower than what was tagged at. And then let's see, the starter was all pelleted, and because of that, if you look at the starch level in the starter was 19%. Well, starch levels in well-texturized starters can be up to 35-40%, but that's not a problem because of the texture and the particle size effect on rumination. But there's kind of a catch-22. If you increase the starch level on the pelleted starter, then you may run into marginal acidosis and need to feed some forage with it or roughage with it in order to avoid that. So now if we look at the results from table 2, we see that the milk replacer intake was virtually the same, which you would expect because they're all fed the same. And the calf starter intake, there's some increase from 0.7 on the control to 0.73 to 0.81. So that was a significant increase. And then the total of those 2 are on that line there. Now, if you look at the total pre-weaned, you don't see that big a change in the starter intake except for 2.62 for the Kefir and yeast. And then the total pre-weaned, you see that the Kefir was 3.37 and the added yeast to that treatment is 3.48. So that does increase some with the addition of those additives. The amount of ME intake is not really much different, but again, that's because the milk replacer is a big part of that, and it's pretty constant across the treatments. And then likewise, the protein intake was about the same. Now, one of the things I liked about this study is that they had a 2-week post-weaning measurement. And I think that's essential for calf trials because if you don't do the post-weaning, you don't have any idea whether there's any carryover effects from the treatments that were being fed to the calves before. And yet it's unfortunately not very often that people do a post-weaning trial measurement. That's because it takes more time and a little more facilities, a little more feeding, but it completes the information that you have available. Now, if we look at figure 1, which was provided by Sarah Morrison, you can see that there's not much starter intake in the first couple weeks. Now, remember, though, they're feeding about 8 liters of milk replacer a day. So that's twice the old traditional 2 quarts twice a day. So when they're getting that much milk replacer, there's not as much starter intake because there's that inverse relationship between the 2. But now notice that about week 4, you start to see some separation in that the middle treatment, the Kefir, is starting to show a little bit more increase than the control. And then when you get to week 7, you see that I'm sorry, I made a mistake. That the middle treatment is the combination of Kefir and the yeast. So it's beginning to show its benefit at week 4, and then it progressively increases at 7 and 8, and you see 9, which is after they've been weaned. The Kefir treatment is creeping up and it's getting closer to the combination treatment, but both then are greater than the control. Now, the other thing about this graph that I wanted to emphasize is that some people will look at this and say, well, they're not eating much starter until week 4, so why don't we just wait till we feed the starter beginning of week 4? Well, the problem is if you do that, you're losing a pattern, which is very key. And that is, I've looked at a number of studies, and the sooner calf starter intake begins, the more you're going to get starter intake over the next weeks or before weaning, because starter intake approximately doubles each week. And even though the numbers are small, if you double them in a couple weeks in a row, they get bigger. And if you don't start feeding starter until, say, week 4, then you push that whole curve to the right, which means you may not get enough starter intake for a long enough period of time before weaning, so you have a slump after weaning. So this really reinforces the key to having early starter intake, because the sooner they begin to eat starter, the more they're going to eat by the time they're weaned. Now let's look at table 3. The body weights. You see the initial body weights are basically the same, and then the combination body weight at 184 is greater than the Kefir alone at 177, and still greater than the control. Now, as we go to the final body weights, we see the same kind of pattern, is that there's still some benefit to the combination over the Kefir alone and over the control. And the average daily gains are right at the same. Now, that may not seem like that high a daily gain, but it's a good daily gain for 2 reasons. First is that it indicates that at 2 months of age, the calves will approximately double their birth weight. And that's the goal that's been agreed to by the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association and most people that deal with calves. So if you have about a 90-pound calf at birth, you want to double that, 180. So you're gaining 90 pounds over about 60 days before they're weaned. That's 1.5 pounds a day. So they achieved that. Now, the other factor is this was during winter time. And so they were using the blankets for 4 weeks of age. And that's also another important factor, because when calves aren't eating much starter, as occurred in this study until about 4 weeks, they don't have the benefit of the heat of rumen fermentation from the starter. And a well-texturized starter will have the best fermentation pattern. So I point this out because that's another reason you want to have starter intake begin as soon as possible, particularly in the wintertime, because the calves benefit from the heat of rumen fermentation. And I think this is true if you look at all large animals, wild animals, that go through the wintertime without hibernating. They're ruminants. And that's because they benefit by having like an internal furnace, the heat of rumen fermentation. And the more fibrous a diet they have, like deer and elk have, bark and twigs or whatever, the more microbial activity and heat of rumen fermentation occurs. And that's why cows do much better in cold weather than hot weather, because in hot weather, they would want to reduce the heat of rumen fermentation, and they do that by eating less, so they produce less milk. So that's an important factor to consider in all of this. The study also measured some blood and physiological measurements, but there were really not any differences there. So that's a summary of the study, Sarah.
Very good. I want to remind our audience to go ahead and post any questions you might have there in the chat or in your social media feed. So, Dr. Kertz, as we like to always wrap up here with, what's the bottom line then in all of this?
Well, bottom line was that combination of kefir and some yeast hydrolyzed product seemed to have some benefit. And overall, these calves were in good health. So if you can find a benefit when calves are healthy, that's a positive effect. But then the other question is, well, if you have a large enough population of calves, or if you have it in a more difficult health problems, what will the response be? Because that's when it would have the most benefit, is when calves aren't doing as well. And so one of the difficulties is that in this case, there were 81 calves, 27 per treatment. That's a good number per treatment, but it's not like you had a trial with about 1,000 or so calves. And so sometimes I think the best place to do trials of this nature are with large calf and heifer ranches, where they can do that and collect the data over a large number of calves. And they're going to certainly have a mix of calves from different sources, and they will have more variation there. So if you can show a benefit under those conditions, then that's probably the best situation. Now, one of the limitations is you would also generally like to do an additive in different levels, sort of a titration, at least 2 or 3 levels. Well, that's hard to do on a commercial calf and heifer ranch. So it's sort of like, well, pick your poison. Some one way has benefits and limitations. The other way have benefit and limitations. So it's not a simple situation.
So probably more to come, I would think, or just kind of give it a trial and see what happens if you're inclined to do so.
Yeah, if you get some good results like this, then you'd have to expand on them. Maybe different levels of the combination here to see whether it shows up. And with different seasons, this was during the winter, so what happens during the summer? Or what happens if you have calves not doing as well as they evidently did in this trial?
Exactly. And of course, Dr. Kertz's column that will be in Feedstuffs, it's online. It's posted there in the chat, so you can take a look at that. It also will be in the upcoming digital edition of Feedstuffs, which is coming out soon. So, Dr. Kertz, we appreciate your time here today.
Thank you. See you next month.
Very good. We appreciate all of you joining us as well. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.